So I will be speaking today because the class, as I've learned, of course, is a class about the different types of capitalism, and it's also a class about inequality. So I decided to combine these two aspects, and quite a lot of that is derived from my new book, the forthcoming one, which is called Capitalism Alone. So let me then start with some, definitions. So you might find, we will see why I think it's actually useful to start with some of these definitions. Now, the first one is you can call a very sort of a standard classical view of capitalism, which is the 19th century view. I called it, in this case, Ricardo Marx view, is that you have two factors of production, like we'll see in the other types of capitalism, labor and capital. And there are two important things. Capitalists have only income from capital, and workers have only income from labor. That's one thing. And second thing is that all capitalists are actually practically richer than all workers. So when I say capitalist, I mean actually somebody who has income from capital, only from capital, and who is rich. In the sort of history of economic thought, this is, of course, called the functional income distribution between capital and labor. But it also led to really underdevelopment of what is my topic, which is interpersonal income inequality. Now, why did it lead to the underdevelopment of that topic? Because by assumption, under the classical capitalism, you really didn't deal with individuals' incomes because it was not important to you. What you needed to know is whether somebody is the owner of the means of production or is a hired worker. So that was, the sort of the idea in the classical capitalism. And that's why you actually have, several years ago, I thought actually I would write something about what Marx thought of interpersonal income inequality. There is very little of that, simply because of the reasons that I just mentioned. It was really inbuilt within the functional income distribution. And that, of course, I mentioned to last point, implicitly, that distribution is a distribution with very high interpersonal inequality, because essentially you have a relatively small number of capitalists who have high incomes, and of course lots of workers with lower income. Then we are moving now to what is actually today's capitalism, which is, I call it meritocratic, or you can call it liberal capitalism, which is different. Now, why is it different? Notice first difference on the top there, that actually most people have now income from both capital and labor. Obviously, not everybody does, and as I will show in a minute, many of people who depend mostly on labor for their income have very little of capital income. But let's keep sort of ideal typical types. The ideal typical type of the meritocratic capitalism is that everybody has, or most people have, income from capital and labor. But what is crucial is that the share of income from capital increases as you go and become richer. In other words, what the rich people have, they have both more income from capital and more income from labor. But as you move towards the top 5%, top 1%, the predominant type of income which they have is capital. So I think it's actually very important to realize the differences between these two types of capitalism. Remember, in the first type of capitalism, there was no overlap between capitalists and workers. Now everybody is both a capitalist and a worker, but the capitalists, the people who actually have most of their income from capital, tend to be richer than people who have most of their income from labor. Although, as you will see that in empirical data, that has also been changing. But the novelty is that among the rich people, you have also people with large labor incomes. This is really something which sort of became apparent only maybe in the last 20 years or so, is that actually you don't have as strong association as in this classical capitalism between being rich and having capital income. Then you have another type, I will come to one more, is you can call that people's capitalism. Now, in people's capitalism, a share of capital and labor income is the same for everybody. And people don't have the same incomes, because I might have more both of capital and labor than you. So my income may be higher than yours. but the share of capital income that I have is the same as one that you have. In other words, what I want to say to make it clearer, let's suppose that I have 100 units of income from labor, 100 units of income from capital, and you have 50 units from labor, 50 units from capital. Does income inequality still exist? Yes, it exists. But are the shares the same throughout income distribution? Yes, they are. So how does this people's capitalism differ from meritocratic capitalism? That you don't have the association of people with high share of capital income and overall high income. You can now have very high income of capital and labor, but the shares that you have are the same. Now, that might get a little bit complicated, but why I'm actually emphasizing the difference between the two? You will see that in a minute. Because if you have a secular increase in the importance of capital in total revenue of national economy, so that, as you will see that in a minute on the graphs, capital has now become a larger component of net income than in the past. If you have meritocratic capitalism, the rising share of capital translates immediately into the rising interpersonal inequality. Why does it happen? Because you have very high concentration of capital ownership. In the people's capitalism, the fact that capital becomes more important in net income does not translate into higher interpersonal inequality. To go back to my example, I had 100 units of capital and 100 units of labor, and you had 50 of capital and 50 of labor. Let's suppose capital really sort of increases in importance, labor stays the same. And I get 10% more because the return is higher and your capital becomes actually more valuable, and you get 5 more. So what happens then? Well, our relationship still remains the same because I actually increased my total income by 5%. Remember, I had 100 from labor, 100 from capital. So I increased my income by 5%, and you also increased your income by 5%. So that would be in people's capitalism, you don't have transmission. I'm sure you would ask me questions about that, but I will explain that the second time as well. You don't have the transmission from the rising share of capital in national output or national product and rising interpersonal inequality. And then the last type of capitalism, which is of course very utopic, the people's capitalism is not so. I mean, you can imagine that you can move towards that by some redistribution of capital. But then you can have another one, which is egalitarian capitalism, where everybody would have the same, approximately the same amounts of human capital, which means labor, income, and of physical capital or financial capital. So there you have the following situation. This is obviously very sort of, how should I say, extreme. But if each of us here has the same amount of labor capital, education, or you could call it human capital, and financial capital, in that case, of course, incomes of each of us would be the same. So you would have still, obviously, private ownership of capital, and you would still have a capitalist economy, but in that case, there is no increase, everybody has about the same income, and the increase in capital share really does not change income distribution, doesn't change interpersonal inequality. So the interesting part is that at that point, libertarianism, capitalism, and socialism really come all together. Because you have a capitalist economy, you have very little redistribution through the state, because you don't need a redistribution, because our market income is the same. So the state does not need to redistribute between high taxation and transfers, which actually libertarians like. And you have de facto kind of a socialism because everybody has the same income. So it's a very interesting sort of theoretical situation where you would actually have libertarians being very happy with small state, capitalists being happy with capitalist relations of production and private ownership of capital, and socialists being also very happy because there is no interpersonal inequality in distribution. So obviously that's the sort of extreme situation. So now when we want to translate that into kind of broadly speaking some reality and then list different systems according to these criteria, was there a rising share of capital in net product and high concentration and so forth, then you have the table. I will not go through each of these cells, but the point is that during the social democratic capitalism, which is kind of, you can say, a variant of capitalism which would be between meritocratic and people's capitalism, you actually did not have, in most West European countries, rising share of capital in net product. You still had very high concentration. I'm talking about the one in the middle, social democratic. High concentration of capital ownership. You had still people who were rich who actually had quite a lot of capital, so there was association between these two. You actually did not have people who are also labor income rich and at the same time capital rich. And I will talk about homogamy, intermarriage of people who are rich. And finally, high correlation of income between parents and children. So what we now have in the meritocratic capitalism, if you look at these cells, and I'm actually talking really in a very sort of high level of abstraction, we have several changes. We have the change number 4, which is, let me start. We have the change in number 1. We have the rising of share of capital in net income. So this is a macro fact. So that fact is simply a fact. Capital has become larger in national income, and practically not only in rich countries, but we see the same thing for China and for developing countries. So this is one change. The second change is that we have now, as I was saying before, people who are at the top of the income distribution, who have large income from both labor and capital. I mean, to give you an idea, people who are investment managers, people who are bankers in the city, their income is labor income. But they also have very high, very often, capital income. So you have the same individuals with high labor and capital income, which was not the case in the past. So you might say, well, this is a good thing. It's not only that the capitalists are rich. But you would see that later I would argue that for taxation and for policy, that may be a difficulty. So you keep in mind that what seems very good development might also have some difficult sides. Another difference is, as you will see, I'll show you the data on that for the US, and it's now more study for different countries, is that the rich people tend to marry each other. In other words, people with high levels of education, high levels of income tend to marry each other. Now, this is also a good result because most of that comes from the higher rates of participation in education and labor force by women. And then a later date of marriage and people who basically get to know each other at a later stage in their lives. And then there is this positive, or what is called assortative mating. So that also looks very good because essentially it enables people preferences to be more, how should I say, reflected in the choice of the partners. You don't want to go back to the 19th century where actually women were basically assigned whom they should marry. But remember, what is interesting there is that might have a negative impact on the overall inequality. It might have a negative impact on the overall inequality because the two rich persons intermarry, and then of course they become even richer, and the two poor persons intermarry, and they become, they become compared to the rich guys even poorer than they were before. And so these are the two differences. And then the last one is the transmission of inequality. We have now more studies of intergenerational transmission of inequality, meaning that the correlation between parental income and children's income is much higher than we thought, and probably much higher than it was in Europe like 30, 40 years ago. So these are the three big changes between the sort of ideal, typical worlds of the two capitalism. So now let me go into to show you some data which would corroborate what I was saying before. Now this is simply a graph. I wanted to show you this is the classical capitalism. What do you have here? This is distribution of workers' incomes. This is the income level, okay, from the poorest to the richest guys. And basically, you would have all the workers' distribution ending before the capitalists come in. So essentially, you have workers who are poor and rich or whatever, but nobody, in a sort of very simplified world, nobody who is a worker would be richer than somebody who is a capitalist. And remember, workers only have income from labor. Capitalists have only income from capital. Now, how does it work in a meritocratic capitalism? I will skip that because I already explained it. how it works there is that rich people, so look, people are now ranked by total income here. So there are poor people here on the left and rich people there at the very end. Now, the rich, as you become richer, you have more income from labor and more income from capital. Notice that both of them are upward sloping lines. But what is happening is that as you become richer, your capital income becomes higher at a higher rate than labor income. So in other words, when you really are in the top 5% or top 1%, your dominant source of income becomes capital income. So as I was saying before, now you have everybody, in this particular graph, everybody, even the poorest guy, would have some capital income and some labor income. And the richest guy would have capital income and labor income. So there is now this difference that even the poor people have capital income, but obviously the income levels are still very different, and the rich guys tend to have most of their income from capital. So that would be the difference between meritocratic and classical capitalism. And then how does it work in people's capitalism? That's actually quite interesting. Now, still, rich people have more of both capital income and labor income. Notice again the two lines going up, but the shares remain the same. You see that actually whatever I place myself, the share, you can imagine that this is actual income level in logs, the share of capital and labor would be the same. So in other words, as I was saying before, if I become richer, I go from 100 to 200, but my share of capital income and labor income is the same as some other poor guy. And that would be the situation where the rising total importance of capital income in national product does not translate into rising interpersonal inequality. So it's very important to realize that actually why, for example, Piketty and others have been really so much zeroed on the importance of rising capital income, because it is very concentrated among the rich people. So concentration is not sufficient for an income source to have an impact on rising impact on interpersonal inequality. Let me give you a counter example to income from capital. It's income from unemployment benefits. The Gini coefficient of income from unemployment benefits is about the same as the Gini coefficient from income from capital. It's very concentrated, right? The 90% of people have zero unemployment benefit in any given year or any given month. Or maybe even 5% of people have positive income. But the difference is that unemployment benefits are heavily correlated with low income level, and capital income is heavily correlated with high income level. So if unemployment benefits as a share of total national product go up, then you have a negative impact on inequality. If the total amount of income from capital goes up, then you have a positive impact on inequality, meaning rising inequality. So let me then go to kind of more fun parts, is actually show you mostly based on the US data, but of course there are many more. I just selected some of the slides from my book. You have quite, for many of these things, you have actually data from a number of countries. So these are the systemic inequalities in liberal capitalism that I basically already implied. Increasing aggregate share of capital in national income, high concentration of capital ownership, higher rate of return on the assets of the rich. That's a very interesting point which I didn't talk about until now. Association of high capital, people with high capital income and high labor income. I gave it a name in my book. It is kind of a Greek neologism called homoplutia. Homo, the same, plutia is wealth. I talked to several of my Greek friends. They could never say that it was a good term, but they couldn't come up with a better term. So I decided, since it's always kind of cool to have a Greek term, I decided, okay, I'll stay with homoplutia for a while. I had actually some difficulty explaining to them what I really wanted the term to show. And it's actually similar to homogamy. The homogamy is the two rich people marrying each other. That's assortative mating. And then the high control of the political process by the rich, and then a greater transmission of interpersonal inequality. So what you see here is that I think there is a certain logic behind that. You start essentially with economic forces which lead to a higher share of capital in national income. And then you sort of kind of go step by step what happens next. What happens next, there is a high concentration of capital ownership. The rich people generally tend to have higher rate of return on their assets. They marry each other. They also have high labor income. So suddenly interpersonal inequality kind of booms and increases as I go every step further. And then they, of course, control the political process, which makes it for them possible to retain the predominant economic role and to transmit that wealth and advantages to their children. So there is, I think there is also almost like a chronological logic, or maybe just simply a logical succession of these points. Now let's see with some numbers. You know, for the rising share of for the rising capital share at the macro level, we have quite a lot of studies. The one that I could have also shown here is by Bourbanis, Kara-Bourbanis and Neumann, I believe. And there is a more recent study by the IMF, which also covers the less developed, developing or emerging economies. I took one from Matthew Rongley. It's about G7 countries. It's basically, the story is everywhere the same. It's that you have the share of capital in total national income is rising, the share of labor is going down. So that's illustration of point one. I think there is really no doubt about that being a phenomenon of the last 3 decades or so. So, okay, we agree with that. Secondly, what happens with the concentration of capital and labor? What this graph here shows you for 4 countries, including UK, as you can see, it shows you in the blue the Gini concentration of income from capital. So this is actually essentially interest, dividends, whatever other income. For example, if you are the owner of an apartment or the owner of something that you rent. So basically, what is the capital income? As you can see here, the capital income from capital is very heavily concentrated because the Gini coefficient is over 90. And this is a feature for all developing countries. For developed countries, we don't have information about that. But for the rich countries, we have Ginis which are always in excess of 80 and into the 90s. Now, this is a huge Gini coefficient because obviously, as you might know, actually, UK overall income inequality is in the range of about mid-30s. So it is much higher inequality than inequality of income. And as you also notice, there is not much of a change in that, partly because the income from capital and wealth is so concentrated that there is no really way to go further toward 1, because number 1 or number 100 would mean that actually the entire capital of the country is owned by 1 person. So really you don't have much room to go above this level. To give you an idea how high concentration of financial capital is, in the US, the top 10%, which is a different way to, not looking of Ginis, to a different way to representing inequality, owns 92% of financial assets. So in other words, practically 100% of financial assets in rich countries is owned by 10% of people. So it's very easy to remember. 10% owns 90. So all of them, you add 90 to 10 is 100. You will easily remember the relationship. That doesn't include, however, housing. When you include housing, then of course the concentration becomes less. But here we are talking about income from financial capital. Now, labor income, as you notice, labor income Gini is much lower everywhere. It's still very significant. That was before taxation. So we are talking about 0.55, 0.60. You notice in the UK very large increase in the 1990s. These are really, you know, the Gini increase of 2 or 3 points. It's pretty big increase. And there it was actually more, almost like 10 points. And you notice that, of course, these are relatively high levels. All of that is before taxation, but they are nowhere as high as concentration of capital. And why is this the case? Because when let's suppose you are here, the population of the UK, because many of, if you take any sample of people, most of the people there, or here, or anywhere else, would have 0 income from capital, or very small. So when you rank them and calculate the Gini index, you have lots of people with 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and then some positive numbers start, and then, wow, there is a big positive number. You don't have the situation with labor. With labor, you would have people with low income, but that would be positive low income. And then there will be gradual increase, better income and higher income and so on. And there will be some people with very high labor income. But it's not like capital where you have a bunch of zeros to start with. And when you have a bunch of zeros to start with, and actually it goes sometimes, actually in the US, you have the bottom 30% with zero or negative wealth. So they actually don't have any positive income from capital. And so obviously when you have 30% of zeros, you're going to have a very high Gini coefficient. So that's another thing. I actually skip here one very important issue. Actually, it was from a book by Ed Wolf, who documented, it's very interesting, the rate of return on the assets of the rich. You know, this was a topic which existed in the 70s and the 80s, but then was forgotten. The question is actually, if you are a rich guy and you have 1,000 pounds, and I'm a poor guy and I have 100 pounds, is our return on average the same? So do really rich people over 10 years outperform me? And it's very difficult, it's not easy to come with a strict answer, but what Ed Wolf shows in his book on the 50 years of US, actually it's like an encyclopedia, it's 1,000 pages, it's a huge book. It's called Wealth in America. It shows that what is happening, broadly speaking, to simplify it, poor people, the bottom 30% have zero assets, so we just forget about them. They cannot have any return because they have nothing. Then everybody from the 30th percentile to the 95th percentile has almost all of their wealth in housing. And when you come to the top 5%, it's financial assets. So essentially the question, do rich people do better than the middle class, boils down to whether the return on financial assets exceeds the return on housing. So when you have the housing bubble and the return on housing is very high, the middle class does pretty well because the returns are also high. But over the long term, the returns on financial assets have outperformed the returns on housing. So that, to the extent that they outperform them, the rich actually make more money per unit of assets than the middle class. Now, the problem, of course, if the rich make more money per unit of assets than the middle class, is that gradual inequality is further exacerbated by that. Now, how do Gini of labor and capital income look in the rich countries around 2013? You notice that they're really fairly similar. You notice how high is Gini of capital income on the vertical axis. It's over 86 up to 97, 96. But one country is very interesting for me. That's the only country that's based on Luxembourg income study data. That's Taiwan. Taiwan is very interesting because historically it's a country which had low, relatively low, as you notice here, concentration of capital income and relatively low inequality of labor income. So it kind of stands out, of course, historically, and then, you know, if you read, and I read a little bit, historically it was that the privatization of the after the war and the new government in Taiwan, privatization was a privatization of Japanese assets. It was relatively egalitarian, and also land reform was fairly egalitarian. But there must be something else because we're talking there about 1950s and the 60s. But still, the distribution of capital income is fairly, inequality is relatively low. Now, let me remind you, in Gini coefficient of 85 is really an enormous number, but it's less than 95. So that's, in that sense, Taiwan stands out. Not that it actually has very egalitarian distribution of assets, but it has, relative to the other countries, more equal distribution of assets. So now the next topic, if you remember all these sort of main kind of systemic features of meritocratic capitalism, is the rising share of labor income among the top. This is from Piketty and Saez, and what you notice here is this is actually really people who are very, very rich, because this is 1/10 of 1%. So it is actually 1 out of 10,000 people. So it's really very rich people. But what you notice among these rich people is that actually this type of income, labor income, in their not portfolio, but in their overall income, has become more important. I was saying that before, is that actually rich people now have also very significant income from labor. And as you can see there, going back to the 1916, that type of income really was minimal for the top, for the people who are at the very top. And you notice that probably until probably 1980s, that type of income was not important. Now, try to sort of think of this graph in the sort of ideal, typical things that they originally started with. That type of system until 1980 was similar to the classical capitalism, because the very rich people basically depended on business income, capital gains, and capital income, not on labor. But from 1980s, labor becomes a more significant component of their income. So we are actually, in that sense, able to reflect the features of the classical and meritocratic capitalism in the data, or actually the data would actually reflect the features that we defined. So another way to look at that, this is a very complicated graph, so I'm not going to go through, I just want to focus on this one, share of factor income among the top 1%. What you notice here is, it's complicated because labor is actually shown on this axis and capital on that axis. It's from a paper by Atkinson and Lackner. I actually think it is somewhere written there. It's Atkinson and Lackner paper. But what is important here to realize is that the very top of the income distribution in the US is gradually having greater share in both overall labor income and in overall capital income. And then when you read these things, you actually read labor is blue, so, and you have read it here, they actually come to have 12% of overall labor income in the US, and as I was saying before, they actually come to have 60% of overall capital income. So you see that their ability to take both of labor and capital is increasing in time. It's essentially replicating, but showing it in a different way, the results that are actually come from Size and Piketty. Now, homoplutia. This is the one that I sort of redefined, at least the term I defined, is reflected in the following. Here, there's also, I'm using fiscal data from Lackner and Atkinson. And you ask the following question. If you are in the, let's suppose that you look at the red line. If you're in the top 1% by capital income, so I take everybody in capital income, and I say, okay, who are the guys who are in the top 10%, 1% by capital income? And I sort of drag them out. There are maybe, 600 of them, or whatever is the number. In the survey, it's actually much more because it's a big survey of fiscal data. So I take this 1%, and they say, how many of them, percentage-wise, are in the top 10% by labor? Now remember, if I did that exercise under Ricardo Marx' classical capitalism, no one would be there, because they are all rich guys through capital, but they don't have any labor income because they're just capitalists. They don't work for, labor income. But what you notice here, actually, there are 50% of them would be also in the top decile by labor. And when you do the same thing, when you reverse labor, how many people who are in top 1% by labor are in the top 10% by capital, you get the same upward sloping line. So that's again illustration of what they called homoplutia, is that you have the people who tend to be rich by both capital and labor. Now notice, as I was saying before, that makes now taxation policy more difficult in some sort of ideological sense. In the Ricardo Marx world, whoever is rich is a capitalist, and you can say, well, this is what used to be called unearned income. We are going to put relatively high tax rate. I'm going to kind of tax these people. Of course, with the mobility of capital, it becomes more difficult, but at least ideologically you say, I will tax them. But now, when you have rich people who are both labor rich and capital rich, the meritocratic element of being rich through labor becomes fairly overwhelming or maybe compelling. And it's actually more difficult to say, well, these guys are doing nothing. They're just, clipping coupons or just basically having income which accrues to them, but it is not the case anymore because they're actually working. And another way, which is actually my favorite graph from Homoplutia, is you actually do the same thing that I did before with the top 1%. Now you just take 10% of capitalists and 10% of workers. And what do you see here? You see very rapid increase of people who are both in the top decile by labor income and the top decile by capital income. You see the rise from 15% in the 80s to 30% almost today. So it's really doubling. So this is what this homoplotia is. Now, since we are in the homo world of the sort of what is all the same, another one is homogamy, which is the assortative mating. So there are quite a few papers on that as well, but this is, I think, a nice stuff that actually Nishant Yonzan here and myself did with US data, because it's more it's more a cohort based. And the question that we ask here from the US data, saying what is the share of, this is from the male's perspective, of men who are in the top decile by labor income, what percentage of such men who are the age of 20 to 35 are marrying women who are also in the top decile by labor income by women and who are of the same age. So these are the cohorts here. In the 1970s, these are a group of people who are 20 to 35 years of age. They were rich in terms of labor income, and what percentage of them, from the male perspective, married women who were also of the same age and the top earners. And what you notice here, there was like 13%, 12.8%. And 13% married women who were actually in the bottom income decile by labor. So basically, in 1980, that particular cohort, if you're a man in that cohort, you were equally likely to marry a woman who was at the bottom by labor income and a woman who was at top by labor income. Now, what happens now with the cohort of the same age people? So they're like youth between 20 and 35 today. And how many now marry women from the bottom? As you can notice, that actually went down from 13% to 10%, but the percentage of those who marry high-earning women goes from 12.8% to 28.7%. So this is, of course, the reflection of what I was talking about of homoplutia. You can then reverse that and then look from the women's perspective, and the story is the same, is that actually nowadays, if you look at the last point, a woman who is in the top decile by earnings is 5 times more likely to marry a guy who is in the top earning decile than in the bottom earning decile. While at the origin 1970, and the original year, the likelihood was about the same. So this is actually the change which has intervened. Now, as I said before, this is basically a good change because it reflects preferences, later date of marriage, ability of people to select others who are similar by their maybe interest, education, and so on, because the same graphs actually exist for the educational level. So exactly the same thing happened. It's actually more similar pairing. But it does have an impact for inequality. And then finally, what was this? Is from a book by Martin Gilens, and there are many other, significant number of new books now, both on Germany and France, but this is on the US, which shows that capture of the political process by the rich. Now, what Gilens did here, he said actually, looked at different policies, and they say, okay, what percentage of people favor a certain policy? Now, if you're at the 90th percentile, this is the probability, how much probability that that policy would be actually changed or would at least come to the consideration of Congress. If you're at the 90th percentile, if there are policies that you don't care about, so that will be here, because really you don't care about that, only 10% of people who are rich care about that, it has very low likelihood that it would ever be debated or brought up. If you have a policy that you really care about it, like 90% or 100% of people who are very rich care about that, there is an almost very high probability or I'm not going to say certainty, but a high probability of 60% that it would really come to be changed. But if you are at the 10th percentile, poor, and the same thing is actually true for the middle, as you can see in the next graph, 50th percentile, whether you really care about something or not basically does not have an influence on whether that policy gets implemented or changed or not. So what actually Gilens concludes, he says the preferences of the middle class matter only when these preferences are fully aligned with the preferences of the top. Other than that, as you can notice, that line for the middle class for the 50th percentile is totally flat. So that was my point about the political capture of the process. Now, I didn't show here, there was a last point which I mentioned, is the correlation, a rising correlation in income between children and parents. And then finally, what are the effects of that? One of them is the shrinkage of the middle class. I'm not going to speak about that too much, and I'm now coming to the end of my talk. But this is well known that actually the middle class in most advanced economies, and not only in the US or the UK, but in the others, has shrunk. This is before taxation. Now, when you use income after taxation with a different definition of the middle class, but this one that is quite frequently used, what you find again that in countries as diverse as Finland or Netherlands or Germany or the US or the UK, you everywhere had the shrinkage of the middle class. So it's not only that the number of people percentage-wise in the middle has shrunk, it's also that their relative income compared to the mean of the country has declined as well. And then I think actually I mentioned also why the policies have difficulty dealing under the meritocratic capitalism with taxation and with other things. Is partly because there is a meritocratic element in that income. So it's very heavily, oftentimes, labor income. Top earners, we know that also empirically, tend to work longer hours. Actually, this is an interesting also reversal. We now have people with higher incomes per unit of labor working longer hours than people with lower income per unit of labor. So that's yet another element that would actually increase inequality, but it's very difficult also politically to say, well, really, I'm going to forbid you from working more because, you're contributing to inequality. So I would, and then of course, there is a transmission of these advantages to children, which I already mentioned, but there are really basically several channels through which it is done. One is obviously transmission of financial wealth, and that's why I think actually I'm very much in favor of fairly high inheritance taxation. But what we see politically is that particular tax has been either abolished in many countries or been reduced. The second way that you transmit that advantage is through education process, which is of course made in such a way that the very high cost of schooling, particularly in the US, is used as disincentive or actually a screening factor not to allow basically children of the middle class to go to such schools, because then the returns from such education become really captured by the elite. So actually I think that the high cost of schooling in the US in private schools has a political function of maintaining the role of that elite. And the third, of course, way that you transmit that advantage is through, general social capital connections and so on. So that basically makes, I will not talk about the rest, so that basically makes the standard policies of taxation and transfers more difficult, and that's why I am in favor, but maybe in the Q&A I can explain that more, why I'm in favor of policies that would reduce inequality in endowments, both in the financial endowments with which we all start and in the endowments of labor through much more accessible education to everybody, through lower cost of schooling, and through ability of everybody to accede or to access very high level of education. So these are the sort of the summary is that actually the emphasis in that case would be on endowments of capital and labor, not so much on redistribution of current income. So let me finish with that, but that leaves a little bit maybe things incomplete, but I will explain that maybe during the Q&A. Thank you very much again.